afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ndumokolo. I'm the team lead for Nextier SPD. On behalf of Nextier family, I welcome all of you to our February development discourse. Incidentally, it seems this is coming at the right time. We will be looking at 2019 general elections, political competition in troubled times. Nextier have designed this discourse to bring in, bring together stakeholders, both in the academia and those who are occupying one political space or policy space. The aim of this is for us to sit and interrogate the looming problems confronting this country and see if we can find a common solution. If we don't get anything today, we'll come back next week. We'll keep coming back here every month and we'll see how the die will keep moving. Today, we are happy we have, they will say we have to drag in a big masquerade. We brought in Professor Carl. He will be discussing, he's the discussant, and we'll be looking at his research. The context of this discussion will be based around the book he wrote, which just came out a month ago. It was published by Cambridge University Publishers. Carl is a professor of political international service at the American University, Washington. His research and policy interest centers around comparative political institutions, democratization, and African security. As an Africanist, like I addressed him, he has written so much about Nigeria. He has the interest, especially coming from, to observe our election. So it means he has an interest in this country. So this discussion will center around a book he wrote, his recent book, which is titled Contemporary Nigerian Politics, Competitions in Time of Transition and Terror. What a topic. I won't be wasting much time. Like next year we're always on time. So can you all join me in welcoming to the podium so that I can make the presentation?
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you to Patrick Okimbo and to Nextier for inviting me to give this presentation. I used to live right around the corner from here shortly after the transition, and I'm pleased to see that you can still buy corn on the street and akara and other things that my stomach enjoys very much. And, I also want to mention for my introduction that I also recently published a co-edited volume of, called the Oxford Handbook of Nigerian Politics, and I want to recommend that volume to you as well. It's a collection of 44 essays, mostly by Nigerian scholars and a few Nigerian practitioners, as well as some Europeans and Americans. And what's very exciting about that volume is that we took a broad approach to studying politics. So we looked at politics from the perspective of geography, from anthropology, from the humanities. And so I'm a political scientist, but took a very broad approach to that. So I'm hoping Oxford University Press will make the Handbook of Nigerian Politics available in Abuja soon. If anybody wants to send a message to my publisher right now, you can tweet to them or something. So what I'm going to talk about today is a few parts of the book, and I suspect some of the parts that I'm not going to talk about may come up during the question and answer. And the first thing that I'm going to start with is an understanding of the political context for the competition in the years going into the 2015 elections. And what I mean by that is that when I arrived in Nigeria shortly after the handover to civilian rule, there were a series of elite deals between the exiting interim administration and then also elite deals within the ruling party. So I'm going to outline some of the elements of what I think were key to those deals, and those, or some of those arrangements falling apart or falling under stress was critical to shaping the environment of political competition going into 2015. So that's one thing I'm going to talk about. Secondly, I'm going to present an empirical analysis of what the two main parties in 2015 actually talked about. What did they campaign on? I mean, you can read Vanguard, you can read Punch, you can read This Day, you can read NIGERIAN, but what did they talk about if we do a systematic study? And I'm going to present some data from a systematic study and that I carried out, and you will find a contrast between what the parties actually campaigned on and some interesting changes in the way campaigns, I think, are unfolding in Nigeria. Third and fourth, I'm going to show you results of two hypotheses that I tested. And what these two hypotheses look at are voting patterns across the state to see if voters voted based on their perception of national security or national insecurity. These are statistical regressions. I can share them with you in Q&A if you want to get into the details. And there are a whole range of control variables that I'm able to add by using statistical analysis. And there are some strengths and weaknesses of doing statistical analysis. And I'll try to explain those and some of those trade-offs and why I made the choices I did. And of course, with the economic voter hypothesis, the idea is, as it sounds, that people voted on the economy. And if that may sound obvious, one thing that I think we're able to do with the comprehensive analysis in this book is we're able to actually get a sense of priorities, what the parties talked about in terms of issues more than other things, and a little bit of how voters are also weighing their priorities. And lastly, as a way of building up to the conversation, a discussion of analysis and implications. Would it be possible to turn off maybe these front lights? I think it'd be better to see what I think the transition pact contained. Some of these things are familiar to you, I suspect. These are based on interviews that I've conducted over the years with party elites, including founders of the People's Democratic Party. And I think it's important to look at all of these things together, rather than just as each individual piece of this so-called pact. The 1980s and 1990s suggests that pacts were not very common in Africa. That this is one of the things that distinguished the democratization process in the 1990s across much of Africa. That change came from below. And in revisiting my thoughts about this, it became quite clear to me that, that there was at least two overlapping elite pacts that were relevant. So within the People's Democratic Party, there was an agreement that, of course, the next presidential candidate had to be Yoruba. And this was not just because of the annulment of the elections in 1993. This is also because of a sense of frustration with the 1979 presidential election. And of course, the 1979 presidential election was determined by the Supreme Court because no candidate met the constitutional requirement for 2/3 of the state and 25%. Also, of course, the idea of power shift, something that was certainly fresh on everybody's mind if you lived through 2010, and geographical zoning of senior positions. This goes, as you all know, all the way down to the LGA level. And also a weakening of the military capacity. It was well known and frequently discussed in the press at the time that there were massive firings, especially of Air Force officers. And the main criteria for this was people who had previously shown some political ambition. Political ambition because politics was a way up through the military for over 16 years. And so this was part of that. And also, of course, Northerners who were concerned about losing power. Somewhat separate from this, but overlapping with this, and something I detail quite a bit in chapter 2 of the book, is that the administration also made several agreements with the interim administration. The interim administration made several agreements with the outgoing military, including going soft on corruption. This is one of the reasons why many foreign donors or foreign countries are still searching for the Abacha loot. And the creation of a Truth Commission which provided neither truth nor reconciliation. The findings of the Oputa panel were never publicly released, as many of you may know. And then what happened was as I just said, a Truth Commission with neither truth nor reconciliation. And the PDP did two things sort of simultaneously over the next couple of years. They also created career paths for the ex-military people as part of this policy to reassure the military. So we can't look, just at the firings of Air Force officers and other sorts of things that Obasanjo did at the time without also noting the many ex-officers that went into the PDP, at least 4 generals that were in the National Assembly, and this is at a time when I was working with the National Assembly very closely. That was my introduction to Nigeria. And lots of smooth paths into the private sector. For a detailed summary of all that, you can look at Bayo Adekanye's research. And then something very interesting also, and there's been less discussion of this, I think, in the Nigerian research, which is coup-proofing. And this is a phrase that Powell and other scholars talk about. There were massive increases in the military budget. Years before Boko Haram, before the Niger Delta rebellions, before all of these sorts of things, and even as some of the ranks were thinning, although those numbers get a little bit murky. And then, largely unnoticed, I'm going to show you evidence of a large wave of promotions within the military. So here's the military budget since 1998. We've got some curious punctuation marks there, but we've got an increase from $793 billion US dollars to $2.2 billion US dollars over a period of about 5 years. That's a massive increase in a very short period of time. This is one slice of coup-proofing. And here are nearly 900 promotions that the military engaged in. What's important about these promotions being documented in the Nigerian Federal Gazette in May 2003 is that this is just a matter of weeks before Obasanjo takes the oath the second time. So you have massive increases in the military budget and a wave of promotions, nearly 900 promotions that follow our standard story and tell a different story, I think, of how the PDP thought about keeping civilians in power and keeping the military in barracks. But what happened heading into the 2015 elections, and this is the context that I was referring to, is that there was a slow erosion of this 1999 pact among elites. By 2011, there were fewer candidates that actually had military background. Power shift, this agreement to alternate power between North and South, had been violated when a Southerner, of course, unexpectedly became president. This is following the so-called invisible presidency of Yar'Adua. And, part of the drama, I think, around this was that this was not written into the Constitution. Power shift is an idea that originated mainly from the 1995 Constitutional Conference. By not writing into the 1999 Constitution, it made it harder for elites to then figure out what to do in the face of a contingency like the one they faced in 2010. And then, of course, the zoning of offices. In research for this book, I drove over 1,300 kilometers across 10 states of Nigeria to interview party leaders, civil society activists, former politicians, all sorts of people. And the story that I heard again and again and again in every state, and indeed you're seeing some of this in the elections now, was frustrated political ambitions among rising party elites. So you want to run for the Senate, but you're from the wrong ethnic group. You want to run for the House, but you're from the wrong part of the state. And this frustration really bubbled over in 2013 and was a really important tipping point in the creation of the APC. The other thing, and Ernie Frenzo Giaga in the room, Nobody? No fans of Yaga? There we go, yeah, okay. Yaga loves this next slide. This is interesting. A demographic gap between the population age and their representatives. So in one of the youngest countries in Africa, in every single election since the transition, the average age of a member of the House of Representatives and the average age of the Nigerian Senate got older. Now that's not a winning strategy for any party, and that's probably not a winning strategy for the country. But this is something I really want you to take home with you, and something that I want all the parties in Nigeria to really think about seriously. And so that, this is a demographic shift. This is not something that you can notice easily in the newspapers. And as a social scientist and someone who is able to sort of pull back from the daily news and from the Twitter feeds and get into the weeds a little bit, these are the kinds of things that we're able to uncover. And I think this is very important and something that we all need to think about. Not too young to run. I think I told Yaga, I said, I think I'm too old to be too young to run. So the heart of the book then follows from that. What I've given you so far is really just the political context for the transition and how I think the transition left these legacies that shaped political competition, that shaped the way political parties thought about acquiring power. And so from here, what the book does is a three-stage analysis. One, I just want to answer the question, what did the parties actually talk about? That's it. This means an elite level analysis, so my unit of analysis for those of you who have fond memories of postgraduate school. This means I'm talking about elites, that I'm studying elite statements. And I looked at elites from each party. Secondly, what conditions or context shaped voting outcomes? This is a state level analysis, so I have about 7 or 8 variables, including several original variables that I spent an entire semester creating with a team of research assistants. And what sort of context in each state shaped voting outcomes, meaning what did the states that voted PDP have in common, what did the states that voted APC have in common? And there's some surprises here. What did voters vote on? And for this, I used survey data from a statistically sampled poll commissioned by the United States government that was included a sample size of 4,000 people. What I'm going to show you first is that the parties campaigned on different issues. So I'm sure every day you read an article talking about how the parties are no longer ideological. I don't think campaigning on different issues means that you have yet acquired ideology. This is something I would invite a conversation during question and answer. But the APC very clearly emphasized corruption in the economy, and to a much greater extent than I expected, electoral integrity. Second, I'm going to show you that state-level economic conditions, even more than the level of violence in the states, shaped voting outcomes. Third, I'm going to show that people voted on the economy, but I will also admit and also be willing to show you additional data that ethnicity does remain relevant and strong, and that there is a growing salience of religion. So that's where we're going. That's our roadmap. So there's your contrast for the two campaigns. So there they are. Visuals for different things. Maybe you can't see it very well from this one, but this billboard, of course, has Jonathan's face crossed out as part of the advert. But remember, going into 2015, Boko Haram is really sort of at its peak. And so I'm not going to talk about it right now, but one of my motivations in writing the book was to really engage the research on comparative terrorism and to think about not necessarily what causes violence and to not debate how to deter violence, but to think analytically about how violence shapes political competition in a democracy. So in other words, I'm thinking about violence as an independent variable, as the causal variable to patterns in political outcomes. 67% said that the government was not doing enough to fight terrorism in 2014. 95% called Boko Haram a major threat to the state in 2015 in a nationally statistically sampled survey commissioned by Gallup. Importantly, with no major distinctions between North and South, meaning that this is not simply people in Lagos or Oyo saying, it's those people up there. People in the South did care about Boko Haram and saw it as a threat to the state. And importantly, in the US government-sponsored poll a month or two before the election, when asked in an open-ended question, what do you think the top priority for the government should be, people said security. And indeed, this is the trend of terrorist incidents from the University of Maryland's database on terrorism. So what I'm building up here is that we would expect voting outcomes to correspond very closely to where there's insecurity. So campaigning on terrorism, campaigning on counterterrorism would be what you would expect, right? But instead what you see is this. So this is based on an analysis that started from 2,390 newspaper articles from Nigeria. And I had a research assistant spend an entire summer going through them all and coding independently 926 different data points to look at what did the parties actually talk about. So the economy and corruption were by far the most popular issue. If you remove corruption, it's still slightly more important than electoral integrity. And electoral integrity as an issue is really interesting and also, I think, really encouraging. So if for those of you who are in civil society and who are working on voter education and working on conflict resolution, this is the evidence that the parties are sort of reading this and talking about fairness as an issue that they think helps them win. Now, I can't take a position on whether you think that's happened to 2019, but if you want to offer your position, I'm definitely listening. And interestingly, the U.S. Agency for International Development and the American National Intelligence Council and the Director of National Intelligence have both issued reports in the last year or less discussing how Africans across the continent are increasingly protesting and winning, and this is one of the issues that they're demanding. They're not just in the streets complaining about the price of fuel, they're in the streets asking for free and fair elections. And so this so far suggests that parties were responding to this somewhat in 2015. Now, here's the difference between the two campaigns, the darker shade being PDP. APC by far talked about the economy a lot more often. They also talked about electoral integrity a lot more often. If you actually go back and read the newspaper articles from 2014, as we did, they said, we're going to have a free and fair primary, and that's going to help us win. And that's, what they did. Similar reactions on party politics, but APC comes out slightly ahead. And insecurity actually ranks third, again, as these issues. Not what we would have expected based on that survey data I just presented to you. Social issues are also interesting. And this is another lesson that I learned in doing this. So social issues include gender. And I hadn't really thought about including gender as an analysis issue, but I had the good fortune of hiring a very smart woman to work for me. She said, you should look at gender. So we looked at gender, and she was right. Don't tell my wife that I admitted she was right, but she was right. And the APC talked about social issues twice as much as the PDP. That was a mistake, I think, on the part of the PDP. Because going into the 2015 campaign, the PDP presidency had shown tremendous strides in, for example, education and health and across a range of Millennium Development Goal indicators and issues that are traditionally or often associated with women's priorities. So this also, I think, is a message to women candidates, I think, on both sides. So next, remember, we're going to look very briefly at two different hypotheses. The first hypothesis looks at insecurity to see how that influenced voting outcomes at the state level, and then I'm going to look at how economic conditions influence voting outcomes at the state level. So the dependent variable here, the thing that the outcome I'm trying to explain in these statistical tests is the change in the PDP's vote share in the state. So if it goes up, then it's a plus. If it goes down, then it's a minus. And it's it's a true value of what the results were in those two elections. It's just looking at the difference. So 3 predictions here, and this is important because remember, one of my goals here is to think about violence in a few different ways. One prediction is just simple, that lower levels of violence could lead to greater support for the PDP. It would suggest that Jonathan was doing a good job defeating Boko Haram, etc. And PDP's support would also be stronger in states where survey respondents, remember this is 4,000 statistically sampled respondents who believe extremist attacks will decrease if Jonathan is elected. So this is a vote for counterterrorism policy. I asked the survey designers if this is what they were getting at in formulating the question in this way, and they said yes. And the next question is a companion question which asks, whether the survey respondent believes that extremist attacks will increase if Buhari is elected. And there's no systematic relationship with violence. A caveat here is that this is not the best test of violence. To have a true test for the impact of violence on voting outcomes, I would want to do this at the local government area level. There's only 37 states, including the FCT in Nigeria, but it's very, very difficult for reasons I can go into later to test it at the LGA level. But nevertheless, this is statistically significant and explains more than 22% of the variation. Or not statistically significant, excuse me. Same thing with this question of President Jonathan. So again, this is people who believe that extremist attacks will decrease if Jonathan is elected. What about if people believe extremist attacks will increase under Buhari? Highly significant and explains nearly 47% of the statistical regression, including all of the control variables for ethnicity, for gender, for economic conditions of the state, and everything I'm going to show you in a minute. What this means, I think, and this is consistent with some of the interviews that I mentioned, is that the PDP used fear to mobilize voters who believe that insecurity would actually increase under Buhari. There was no comparable mobilization of APC supporters based on this test via negative evaluation of Jonathan. So another way of thinking about this is that the APC ran a more positive campaign, and it worked. This can also be interpreted as more potential good news for electoral politics in Nigeria. I'm getting to the bad news a little later. The other thing that's really interesting, and something that scholars of oil distribution and fiscal federalism will want to note, is one of the variables that I constructed was the level of state debt in every state of Nigeria going into the election. The best predictor of how a state will vote is the level of debt. If you borrowed a whole bunch of money, who do you think you voted for? Voted for PDP, because you are afraid that you might not get bailed out if the other guy wins. So every single test that is, this is the list of the what we do call control variables. So debt, the level of internally generated revenue, the level of disposable income from a survey aggregated to the state level, the party of the governor, because we all know governors are very powerful political figures. So if you've got a PDP governor, then you would expect him, or, well, I guess we can't say her yet, but you would expect him to be able to mobilize supporters on behalf of the party, etc. And turnout, that the statistical results could simply be driven by an unexpected increase or decrease in voter turnout, and the other variables. I have a whole separate chapter on ethnicity, because testing for ethnicity at the state level is not the best way to do it. So then I do those tests again in the following chapter, and we can talk about those later. With the economic voter hypothesis, every single way I test this is statistically significant. And I test this with 3 different kinds of questions. One question is retrospective thinking. How do you think the economy performed over the last year? The second test looks at the subjective reported level of family income on a scale of 1 to 5. The third test is forward thinking, which is whether Buhari can improve Nigeria's economy, or whether Jonathan can improve Nigeria's economy. So what this means is that we have 3 different kinds of tests, 4 separate models, and several control variables which you can add or remove in order to measure the economic performance and economic conditions of the state in different ways. We've got perceptions, observed empirical conditions, and self-reported empirical conditions. And what we get is that in every single test there's a strong statistical relationship between how the state voted and what the economic conditions or perceptions of conditions were. Again, the outcome, the dependent variable in these statistical tests is the change in the PDP's vote share in the state in question. So if your evaluation of the national economic performance over the last year was positive, each unit of increase in that variable meant nearly a 15% more support for the PDP. And this explains almost 35% of this statistical model. With the income level, each unit of increase explains more than 12%. Again, highly statistically significant. And last 2, support for PDP, whether people believe Jonathan can improve the economy, statistically significant, or whether Buhari can improve the economy, also statistically significant. Slightly stronger for Buhari. This means both parties, the economy influenced voters for both parties, but it was slightly stronger for Buhari. So, I'm going to do the analysis in a moment. Does anybody, before we talk about that, I'm almost done. Before we talk about that, does anybody have any technical clarifications that might help understand the analysis? I'm a professor, so I know to pause from time to time. Okay. So, one interesting thing is that the level of violence was not a systematic predictor of party support. That doesn't mean that violence didn't matter. What statistics can do is give us a level of confidence of a pattern. That's what we have from this analysis. It can't tell us the stories, it can't tell us about the pain of being an IDP in Adamawa or Yobe. It can tell us what the pattern is. And this is something that I think speaks to a really interesting debate in the research on comparative terrorism, which is that after 9/11 in the United States, there was what we call a rally around effect. And what the research talks about is that after there's a traumatic event, which doesn't have to be a terrorist incident, it could be an earthquake or a tsunami, that citizens tend to rally around the flag. So support for the president in those circumstances, in other words, go up. What we're seeing in Nigeria, and this is not unique to Nigeria, but what we saw in Nigeria with those pair of tests on Buhari and Jonathan on the counterterrorism policy was polarization. And so stoking fears of terrorism speaks to a kind of polarization instead, as a response. Another thing is that, as I already said, more economically vulnerable states tended to support the PDP, and debt was significant in all the models. I think that may be a typo there. So the economy mobilized all voters, but stronger effects for the APC. The economic voting, because those pre-election surveys were, showed priority for other things, I think this suggests that the voters were primed. Again, meaning that because the APC kept talking about the economy and corruption and really remained focused on that, that actually, once you got to election day, had moved voters a little bit, parties actually shaping voter preferences. Now, there is a little bit of an inferential leap I'm asking you to make in suggesting that conclusion, but that's what I think the evidence points to, and I think that if we wanted to dig deeper in that and confirm that, I'm hoping there's some PhD students in the class who will do so in the class. Did I just say that? I'm missing my home this week. And so those negative evaluations of performance in economically weaker states all were supporting the APC. In other research that I published with Matthew Page and Yoon-Bin Ha, we call this a Talakawa effect. So that, Buhari really was mobilizing a sort of alienated economic class of people. In America, nobody talks about class anymore, so sometimes I have to explain what that word means. And so I think this has a couple of important implications. One is that, voters do seem to be learning democracy. This is especially, I think, manifest in the way the electoral integrity is played out in Nigeria, and as I said, that's consistent with some of the stories and some of the evidence coming from other African countries. One thing I worry about, and I think something for the conversation of political restructuring to consider, is that the electoral system here was designed to promote inter-ethnic cooperation, and I think excuse me. I think it remains an open question of whether that is also successful at deterring religious cleavages, whether it's building a sufficient north-south bridge. And then lastly, to link the political context provided by the transition in the first part of the presentation of where we are, the book concludes with a chapter about democratic stress. And so here I was trying to engage some of the classic political science literature on democratic consolidation. And in reviewing the book with a number of colleagues and friends and presenting it at conferences, presenting it at NIPS, presenting it at the University of Port Harcourt, presenting drafts here in Abuja, a lot of people said, don't talk about consolidation. Talk about something else. And so I had this idea of democratic stress. And the idea behind democratic stress is, can the political institutions withstand challenges from outside the political institutions? This is what MEND is, this is what IPOB is, this is indeed what Boko Haram is. These are challenges to the political institutions where people have made a calculation to not go through the political institutions and the mechanisms of interest aggregation. So there may be some disagreement about the Igbo secessionism. I did get a chance to dig into that a little bit. One of the things that I learned in the 4 Igbo states that I met with was that virtually everyone I talked to began the conversation by talking about Alex Ekweme not becoming the vice presidential candidate or the presidential candidate in 1999. That is still a very powerful narrative and a motivating factor in politics, and one that shapes how people plan to vote. And I also, talked to people who were at the PDP primary in Plateau State and, heard the stories of intrigue and so forth. So there's a picture I took in Imo State. I know for you this is just a nuisance, but for me this is data. And of course the coup proofing, that this hollowed out the military in a way. And so, when you have this explosion of Boko Haram starting around 2011, you've had more than a decade of a hollowing out of the military, arguably as part of this effort to keep the military in the barracks and keep them happy and in some ways disengaged from politics, but disengaged, also from some of the simmering security threats that were on the horizon. And this also, and the last point, I think may also be controversial in the room, but I think the legacies of impunity from the transition have compromised civil-military relations, or contributed to the compromise of civil-military relations in Nigeria. Virtually no one was held accountable after the Abacha regime exited. Instead, what they got, as I pointed out, and as is documented by Adekanye and a little bit by myself and others, is positions in the private sector, positions in the party, and so forth. And so, I know a common complaint about democracy is that, especially in the West, we tend to think about democracy only in terms of elections. This is where I say, yeah, you're right. Let's talk about democracy in terms of rule of law as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. You just reminded me that I studied political science. I know, I'm just remembering the phase that I walked into my first year at the University of Nigeria, and I was to meet a very professor LeVan. Political science 101. That's what I'm hearing now. Very interesting. Yeah. Well, I won't be interrogating anything now. So we're going to go into a kind of a Q&A section, and I will be calling on someone to moderate it. Incidentally, as I keep working with this guy, I've forgotten what he studied at the university. I don't know whether he studied mass communication, arts, music, computer science. I just don't know. Political science. But I remember he studied agriculture. From there he went to business and everything. Patrick Okibo the third will be moderating this. I don't want to talk about him, but let's listen to him.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. We can get the lights, please. Thank you. Please, another round of applause for Carl. And for the rest of the evening, I'll probably, pose one or two questions, and then we'll open it up for audience participation. Because I'm also as interested in hearing what you have to say as what Carl has shared with us. In the book, which I'm yet to read, but I've tried to, look at some of the videos of where you presented and some of the earlier versions of lectures. What I see come through is your belief, if I read it right, that the elite deals or the elite pacts that started sometime around 1999 probably came to an end with the 2015 elections.
Yes.
And that the 2015 elections were the end of the beginning. In fact, I think that's in chapter 2, something like that. Had another thing around it, given what's happening with 2019. Are you saying that you're not seeing any of that elite negotiations or pacts playing out with the 2019 elections?
So I'll answer that question, but before I do so, I also want to mention that because I'm here on a mission, I can't talk too much about the 2019 elections. What I can say is that I think that, first of all, the literature talks a lot about how pacts come together and how they facilitated democratic transitions in many places. The best models are actually from Southern Europe and from Latin America, so places like Spain and Chile, with very explicit agreements between the military and the civilians who wanted to take power. And the military was just saying, look, we're tired of all these protests in the streets, we're tired of ruling, just what can you do to give us a softer landing? But there wasn't much of a discussion about when those pacts end. And so by pinning the point on 2015 in Nigeria, it's a good deal later than I think all of the literature really thinks about the transition. And so I think what's good and kind of interesting is that the pact was electorally eroded. And it was loaded by some of these shifts within the PDP, the frustration over zoning within the states and so forth. And I think what I can say about 2019 now is that if that pact has eroded, then we don't know what it is right now. And I think that uncertainty is definitely something that shapes political competition right now. And in that regard, there were some advantages to having the transition deal cut by elites and behind closed doors where they could trust each other. They're no longer behind closed doors, and so it makes it a little bit harder in some ways to cut those bargains and to figure out what people want. And obviously power shift is still an important part of political culture and political tradition here, and I think that there are reasons for that to continue. I did interview Amachi for the book and asked him about this, and he said, it's not in our Constitution. And he meant the party Constitution. And he meant that also as a sign of something that was different about where he thought the country was headed. I don't know if they stand by that observation now, a few years later, but I think those things are important and part of the pact. What I think Nigerian citizens didn't sign on to, and they're still living with, is the impunity and the problems of rule of law, from the police and other things, all the way on up to the top.
Yeah. So again, in the book, there was a lot of talk about changes to campaigns and how campaigns are evolving. A great belief that we're beginning to evolve towards ideas-based politics, even if we haven't gotten to ideologies yet. And I know you can talk a lot about the 2019 elections, but from what we're seeing, does that hold out from the data you saw right in the book?
Yeah, so great question. So the chapter that comes next, chapter 5, I statistically test for ethnic self-identification of the voter and his or her voting intentions, against his or her voting intentions, again with a series of control variables. And ethnicity definitely predicts voter preferences. That is consistent, though, with the story that's coming from other research on African elections in Malawi, in Kenya, in Ghana. And what those analyses by colleagues and friends of mine show is that ethnicity might make you politically relevant, but issues help you win. And so it's possible for both of those things to be true at the same time. And I think one thing that is clever about Nigeria is that you have built it into your institutions and also your traditions that it's very hard to win if you think you're just representing one ethnic group or one region. And I think it's good, maybe to keep demanding that.
There was a slide you showed, and we're going to open it up for questions after this. But there was a slide you showed where you tracked how each of the parties campaigned in 2015. Probably mentioned in the news or something. Did that capture the quantum of the level of campaigning from each of the parties, or just the issues? And where I'm going with this is to see if PDP lost that election because it did not campaign as hard as it should have, and if there's something to learn from that, even around the 2019 elections.
Okay, that's a great question because I have a really cool answer for you. One thing you may have noticed from that slide, for those of you who do have fond memories of graduate school and you're eager to critique me, is that there were more data points for the APC than the PDP, which would suggest there's a problem with my data, right? The reason why there are more data points for the APC than the PDP is because we had to drop about 400 coded responses for the PDP because they weren't talking about the issues at all. They were talking about weddings and funerals and colonialism. And so, that on the one hand, that's sort of the old patronage networks. That's how you build your friends and allies and this sort of thing. But, what happened in 2015 is that the party that actually talked about the issues a little bit more is the party that came out ahead. So I don't know, even impressionistically, if that's happened in 2019, but that's certainly what I found in 2015. And so I think that's an interesting lesson and one that I hope advances politics here and it makes it better for the citizens.
And we'll open it up for questions. If we can get the mic
My name is Dr. Dayo Kusa. I'm a conflict transformation expert based in Abuja, former director, Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, the presidency of Abuja. That's the second time I listened to you, and I can see a lot of projection and improvement in filtering in some of the things you've heard from the caucuses you've talked to. And I'll pick out a few. The first is the concept of democratic stress rather than democratic coalitions. In Nigeria, it may not be so easy to talk about coalitions, but the stress pushes out something. I won't call it coalitions, but we'll leave it as stress. Then the issue of coup-proofing was not so much on the table when you presented at CDD, Center for Democracy and Development. I think that was last year.
Yeah. And
I was the one actually anchoring that event, I think. So, coup-proofing, you just talked about coups and how they come up, and you didn't really link it to removing soldiers from the polity, which is an improvement. I mean, the work is progressing, and by the time you do a second edition of the book, this will come in, and they will have a more robust. Then the legacies of impunity, compromise civil-military relations. Well, you looked at civil-military relations, but you did not really look at the legacies of impunity. We talked much more about impunity as a concept and how we could get around it in the polity. Lastly, I'm not scared to talk about the 2019 elections in Nigeria, although I'm in the situation room of one of the major NGOs in West Africa. But I'm a Nigerian, and I shouldn't be scared to talk about it. I think two major things that have come out from 2011, 2015, and 2019, it looks like it's the same recurring decimal of lack of preparedness. And we believe that when we have 50 professors in INEC, then the work will be done. I'm not in that school of thought. A professor could look at concepts and come up with whatever. Could be a coterie of issues. But that does not solve the problem. Where I'm going, I want to be exact. We need program management. We need a section, a division of program management within INEC. And we also need a section on scenario building. Those are two sections that should be working hand in hand so that we do not have the same cycle of something happened and we postpone elections. It does not make it foolproof. But these sections should join whatever they have in INEC. Project management, scenario building, then we're talking about procurement. It should be a different section. Then these two sections should now be able to put together everything. I thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Contemporary Nigerian politics, and I think Patrick had expressed concern. How contemporary? I imagine it ought to be dealing also with what's on the ground. So like she said, the matter of updating will help, and that's the concept of the contemporaneity. The making sure I want to take up, and because of the presentation you spoke about coup-proofing, and the work itself, I indicated interest in it, but from your presentation, it rests on the assumption that there is a Nigerian state, defined the way states are defined, which will tend to plan or plot a new trajectory from 1999. Prof, I want you to contemplate the possibility that at that time and up till now, the Nigerian state remains a criminal enterprise. So the elite consensus you're talking about was actually the fallout of conspiracies they didn't know how to manage. And so you put together a political party, you cook up whatever you can, because a new government needs to protect you. You were a general, you didn't have a farm, you didn't have a kiosk, you didn't have a shop, you produced nothing. But by the time you left office, you were a billionaire. Your house is the equivalent of a first-class hotel. So you create what will protect that for you. And what I want you to take up, because I didn't see in the presentation any linkage between any explanation of the impact of expenditure on social cohesion and political discipline. I'll give 2 examples. In the 90s, there was a petroleum trust fund. I don't know if it was headed by the current president. It was basically, there was an increase in the price of petrol, so the tax was put aside for infrastructure development. Great idea. But a Minister of Health, I have a budget for providing vaccination for everybody in this room. BTF has a budget for the same thing. Accounting doesn't take place. Double expenditure on the same item, so you have an irresponsible state running slush fund at its own discretion. And the impact of taxation is that there's a relationship between point of access and deployment. So you have 82% coming from the south to create that fund, and 79% expenditure in the north. So you ask yourself, what would a citizen that sees perfidy as a major raw material for public administration do? And you take it to the military, and they tell you talking about coup-proofing. I think that's when the money that got the service chiefs into trouble. Every month somebody pulls out 558 million naira. That's under no heading. I remember we discussed it 3 or 4 years ago. I told them this will eventually blow. Now, to play it the way it does, it wasn't even democratized. By that time, the amount didn't lose weight as it was traveling. If you have lost some weight, at some point, by the time you want to look for it, they will create barriers. They will bury it in good paperwork. So when I saw that the transactions were very neat and straight, I say it's a matter of time. This money is too much. It's a one-source deposit, people will get into trouble. Now where am I leading to with all of this? Contemporary Nigerian politics is defined by all the things you've mentioned. In addition to the fact that you have an elite that's driven by consumption and distribution only, no production. And to that extent, too, you've created a followership that believes that the man who is not caught is actually a lucky thief. And the one who is caught is an unlucky thief. But that everybody in office is comfortable because. So, the basis for social cohesion and political loyalty has collapsed under a budgeting and expenditure system that assumes that accountability is an inconvenience. Okay. So if we can put all of that together so that the analysis then incorporates the impact of multiple budgeting and expenditure, its ruinous impact on political cohesion and patriotism. Thank you.
So, you started off by saying that, should we consider Nigeria a state? And everyone knows Awolowo's famous, comment that Nigeria is a mere geographical expression. I think it is a state. Whether it's a nation is something I leave for you to decide. And the distinction is that the state is something with sort of fixed boundaries that are honored internationally and domestically, and Nigeria has all that, and more or less assert power across that territory. Sometimes that power is challenged, but that's what we mean by a state. Whether it's a nation, that's an ongoing project, and this is something that Ezekwe and her colleague and the others really were pursuing. One thing that I debated with readers of the chapter on the transition, and I think I revised in conversations with them, was whether the elites that came in 1999 were any different from the elites that came before them. And I think that that's a fair question, and I don't think that necessarily presents a problem for the analysis here. My number one question here is, how did the APC win in 2015? That's my research question, and what's the story leading up to that? What you had in 1998 and 1999 was a temporary convergence of interests among a broad section of elites. That temporary convergence, and some of that convergence could have been around looting and padding budgets and so forth. That temporary convergence has always been contentious, and in 2015 that understanding was shattered. One interesting concept from the Nigerianist literature that people play around with is pirate capitalism. Schatz wrote a classic book, in the 1970s that talked about pirate capitalism in Nigeria. This is my third book on Nigeria. My first book on Nigeria engaged more explicitly some of the questions that I think you're more particularly interested in, which is public policy. And so, the subtitle in this book is Political Competition. The subtitle in that book was Political Economy. And, what I found in that book was that, corruption was a very big part of Nigerian politics, but it was also a big part of Nigerian inclusion. And so, I think Nigeria going forward needs to figure out sort of what the balance is between the people at the top and the people below, the ordinary citizens, in understanding inclusion and framing political competition. Because it can't just be about the elites at the top anymore. So I hope that addresses your question mostly, and maybe gives you, my terms of reference for how I think about a question like that. Very quickly, the question about electoral and about INEC. I'm not going to comment on 2019. What is interesting in 2015 from the data on electoral integrity is that young people trusted INEC less. And I don't know what the data are now with regard to that, but you can sort that survey data by age cohort. The first-time voters, and I think the second-time voters as well, are the ones who were a little less trustful of INEC. And with growing population demographics and politicians at least paying lip service to young people, that's something to really think about, and and keeping electoral integrity, at the center of the conversation as a campaign issue and not just as an administrative reform issue.
Thank you. Let's take from the middle.
My name is Margie. I work with Care Frontier. I came from Kaduna. Mine is a question. Listening to your submission, I'm convinced that you did your analysis on the prison of elites theory. And I realize there is so much talk and contextualization about the influence of voters' conviction. And you talked a lot about what the influences are. And I think there is a missing link about the strength of groupthink. So the concept of groupthink, the constituency that I represent, what are they saying? What direction are they going? And that influences my conviction with respect to what I think. So the question I'm asking is, supposing you have done this analysis within the framework of power theory, looking at what Morgenthau said in his work, will you have had the same submission? Will you have had the same conclusion? If no, what do you think will be different in what you have achieved?
Juliet Kego. I'm a poet and a gender advocate. So my question is going to be about the very interesting point you raised about gender. I think my real question is, I wanted to ask something about 2019, but since you're not going there, if we go historically for APC and the PDP for 2015, right, what would you say were the differences in terms of how they approached the agenda? Because the question you asked of the elite that came in, were they different from the ones that came before? There's really not been much of a difference between how both parties have addressed gender issues. And since this is about competition and in terms of in an era of terrorism and all that, you see that there's that intersection where gender is really key I mean, the lead up to the election, there was the whole issue about the Chibok girls. And then now, no one's talking about Leah Sharibu, for instance, and Alice Loksha Ngada, who's still held by Boko Haram or ISWAP, we don't know who. So, other than that, right, I'm also trying to link the gender issues. So when you talked about non-state actors, in terms of men, right, Boko Haram or even IPOB, is there a possibility then of having a political party occupy the space of the non-state actor? So in other words, a third force that would actually mobilize around gender, since no one is really doing a lot around that in terms of mainstreaming, in terms of really, leading up the way Rwanda is, or Ethiopia, or Senegal. So that's my question. It's kind of two-pronged. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for the presentation. I am Okola, a political scientist also. My question is just very, very simple. Would the PDP have lost the 2015 elections if it chose a northern candidate and missed every other variable?
Good afternoon. My name is Amadu Ejike, University of Jos. From your presentation, Professor Carl, you want me to believe that the INEC of 2015 was transparent, absolutely transparent. We had instances that we had hate voting. There were allegations that even the INEC chairman had a romance with the party in power today. And all your solutions were based on that election. So, how can you convince me to believe that your solutions will be taken by me? Secondly, based on the transparency of INEC, because I want to believe they were not very transparent during that time. And I want to know, because I know very well the president of the country at that time led issues concerning that transparency. Because he wanted peace to reign. He didn't want to go on with some of this, what he would have done as a commander-in-chief. Secondly, in your histogram there, data presented that APC campaigned on votes, on issues, meaning that PDP did not campaign on issues. I may not agree with that, because I know that PDP have made some progress in the country, in terms of economy, in terms of rule of law, and their major strategy was to move to the next level. So, for me, that was an issue. It was issue-based as well. Thank you.
All right, so those are 4 questions times a factor of 2, I think. So I'll start with Mr. Magnet's question from Kaduna. Kaduna is one of the places I went for my research. And so your missing link about groupthink is really interesting, because I read a little bit of the psychology research just to think about how social psychology was thinking about terrorism, for example. And one of the concepts that psychologists are using to think about these kind of shocks to the system is affective intelligence. And the affective intelligence theory, suggests when it comes to politics that people become more interested in politics and more skeptical of their evaluations of policy performance when you've got stuff like Boko Haram happening. So then the comparative political scientists come in and do cross-national tests, using countries where terrorist groups are active, and one of the key findings is that incumbent parties are vulnerable. So you connect those two things together, and I'm just updating the term groupthink a little bit, that this is one of the new ways of thinking about groupthink. What I think you meant by power sharing is sort of the idea of a coalition of elites just running the party, or running the government. The PDP as a big umbrella. And I think the point that I'm trying to make is that there were a number of things, such as the demographic shift, such as frustrations over zoning leaving out ambitious politicians, that made that power-sharing understanding within the party fall apart. This is why there were so many defections from the PDP in 2013 and 2014. And you know that from reading the newspapers, and I know that because I talked to a lot of those politicians for the book. And so, and I detail some of those defections in an article in African Affairs, January 2018, about River State, where I linked the competition in River State to national level political contests. So that's one way to think about that. The way power sharing. So the power sharing arrangement had sort of come under stress. And then this is where we are today.
I was talking about looking at it from the framework of power theory.
Yeah.
Because you concentrate on analytics theory.
Yeah. Well, from a power sharing theory, Nigeria has an informal power sharing system, but it has a formal competitive system. It's a very majoritarian constitution. He or she who wins the presidency, controls the cabinet, can fire people at will, and so forth and so on. It is truly a presidential system. There's no incentive and no history of the president in Nigeria in a significant way of having other parties in the cabinet, for example. If that's what you mean by power sharing. If you mean informal power sharing, as this gentleman was suggesting, elites sharing power and sharing the national cake, then, you do have some of that. We can talk more afterwards if you're... moving on to gender, I think the point on gender that I'm making is that it's an unclaimed issue. I think it's a good campaign issue. And I think for whatever reason, the major parties, even after I told them about this, a year or two ago, didn't see that. Is a third force a plausible scenario for making it an issue? I think that'd be very tough to do from the perspective of a party. And that's, again, because that's what, the electoral system in Nigeria is doing what it's designed to do, which is have two major parties. Two major parties secured 95% of the vote in 2015. And that's, the outcome of a long trend of smaller parties getting fewer and fewer votes since 1999. But, the Bring Back Our Girls movement and whatever may come out of that, if there's something that can be sustainable, that can speak to power and also have credibility at the grassroots, then maybe you can get a seat at the table. This is what happened with the Tea Party in the United States. This is what happened to some extent with the Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States. They didn't set out to campaign. They didn't set out to form a new party. They said, we're going to move into the party and get our issues on the agenda. The Tea Party was very successful at that. The other thing sort of related to that, which I think is something to think about for the future and is right for maybe NGOs here to think about, is that there are millions of IDPs in this country. And one of the things that we know about post-conflict research and IDPs from Rwanda, from Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, from some interesting cases, is that when the men are killed, women step up and assume new leadership roles in their community. When the war is over, it's hard to take that empowerment away. So one thing that I would be thinking about, and I would look to scholars like Hilary Matfis and others for thinking this through, is what are the social dynamics going to be in Yobe and Borno and Adamawa and Benue and Taraba and Plateau 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when, hopefully we thank God things have calmed down and these women are then expected to go back to their traditional roles, and they're not going to go there maybe. So, and that becomes a political constituency. Third thing, would the PDP have lost if it was a northerner? This is the question that, could maybe sink the whole book, I guess. And, we call it a counterfactual. I think people in the South and the Southeast, told me that that was the mistake that the PDP made. It's also, that Jonathan allegedly, broke his promise in 2011 not to run in 2015. So I don't know. I think, if the PDP had run a different campaign on the issues that I think were more winning issues, then maybe that would have helped. And I think as evidence to that, I might point to, some of the positive reception that, I'm not speaking to 2019, but, 2016, 2017, Osinbajo, received some positive responses in different parts of the country. And, we don't know for sure. But, there are unclaimed issues out there, and I think the parties need to find them. This is an emerging research agenda in my field of politics, comparative politics, that, in Africa, the parties are still running on similar sets of issues like the ones we talked about. No one's really campaigning on things like free market versus state-led development. That would be an ideology. Pretty much nobody in Africa is doing that the way they were doing that, talking about that in the 1960s.
But I think now it's happening. I think in this election, we actually see the clear difference between the APC and the PDP.
Well, I don't know. If you think ideology is emerging, then that is consistent with the story that I was presenting, that there was a difference in the issues that they talked about. One last question.
Yeah, the last question was from what else we'll get to you, and you can raise that issue. So his argument is that the book is based on some basic belief that a 2015 INEC was transparent, not partisan, etc., but that if that's the case, then it puts to doubt some of the data presented in the book.
Sure. A couple of things. So, there was a high confidence level from domestic organizations and from international organizations of INEC in 2015. There are a lot of problems. You use the word transparency. The biggest frustration with transparency is that, from my point of view as an analyst, is that the local government area election results at the local LGA level were never fully published. And that's, basically what the electoral law required. That's a problem with transparency, and that's something that I think, Nigerians all need to demand and expect a month or two from now, no matter what happens in the election on Saturday. I think that there's a high enough level in results at the state level that we can say that we know which states PDP won, we know which states APC won. And for the states where the PDP did win, what becomes suspicious is maybe the margin of victory for how a party won. But that's something that, again, you can isolate in an anecdotal story, and I think I do a little of that towards the end of the book. But what statistics can do is give you the overall pattern. And so if there is an anomaly in one or two states, that's sort of outweighed by the overall numerical results from across 37 states. And so I was not claiming that the PDP did not claim on the issues entirely, campaign on the issues. They clearly did campaign on some issues. My first observation, Patrick keeps using the word belief, I would say observation, is that they campaigned on different issues. And the fact that they systematically campaigned on different issues offers a strong basis of inference that that mattered. Not only did that matter, but in the book I break down within the party to see if the party leaders whose comments I was coding campaigned on the same issues, and almost across the board completely, they did, further suggesting that within the parties they were coordinating on what issues to talk about. And then I went to the states and asked the state leaders what issues were most important to you in 2015, and they said different things. So that's 3 lines of analytical reasoning supporting the idea that the parties campaign on different issues. What I think I was trying to clarify when I made that comment about the PDP not campaigning on the issues was that they talked about non-issues in the sample of 2,390 newspaper articles, more than the PDP, where the PDP was talking about weddings and funerals and the history of colonialism, the APC was out there talking about corruption.
Okay, there was a more, the last round, so let me see if I can articulate that. The comment was on ideology, on whether we have a party that's running on capitalist principles and another that is a bit more statist or socialist. So I wonder if you can just touch on that before we take another round of questions. And what we're beginning to see, without making any statements on the 2019 election, is that it appears that one party is clearly pro-market and the other party appears to be more pro-state.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would generally make that observation. Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. I mean, you know, Atiku has made it quite explicit he wants to privatize the oil sector. You know, Buhari's made it quite explicit that he thinks import tariffs and borrowing is okay. Deficit spending is okay. Those are different models, and you know, you guys can decide for yourselves which one you like more. And you know, those are maybe the building blocks of ideology, and you know, that could be a constructive thing. You know, where we are in America right now is that ideology is the problem, or a problem. So, you know, philosophers like Alexis de Tocqueville thought ideology was good in a democracy because it would help people from changing their minds too often. And now, you know, in America, we're at this point where people won't change their minds at all. And so, you know, as you build your ideologies, you know, keep hanging out with the other party.
Okay, so let's take some questions at the back and then we'll come back to the front.
I want to take up one of the issues that arose in the last session, where I think one of the contributors said Nigeria is a criminal, the Nigerian state is a criminal enterprise. I'd like to argue that all states, almost all states, if not all states, start out as criminal enterprises and then essentially legitimize themselves through time. I stress that because I try to avoid the portrayal of Nigeria in as an exceptional type of case. I don't agree that it is. I think that it is probably where a lot of nations were at some point in time. The second thing is the distinction between state building and nation building. States can be created by the stroke of a pen. Nation building takes time. Flowing from that, Carl talked about an elite pact or an elite consensus. And I think that when we look at unwritten pacts, these things generally tend to be problematic. Lebanon is a good example of how an unwritten pact generally doesn't end well. But I would say that this pact that we have is unraveling. We're in the middle of that unraveling, largely because the pact essentially was about distributing oil rents. This is something that emerged after the Civil War, and the best way to avoid a repeat of the Civil War is to ensure that oil rents are distributed as fairly as possible among regional elites. The problem is that oil rents are finite. The population growth rate has increased. Nigeria's population has increased fourfold. In 1970, we were 55 million. We are around 200 now. So I think that those things are creating stresses on the pact that are unraveling it. You have a lot more people that are excluded rather than included. My question would then be, is it time to consider a system that emphasizes proportional representation rather than the majoritarian system we have now? If you have such a system, proportional representation will ensure that various shades of conviction and ideological belief or allegiance or non-allegiance, as the case may be, will be accommodated and therefore mitigate the risk of violence in our politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I found out that your perspective of a state, it appears legalistic and prone to what we call Western liberal view. In your own part of this world, you know how the state was formed and the processes. Here, the Nigerian state is non-existent. For me, it's still in the process of formation. And that's why the structures, the institutions are so weak. That's why we don't have ideology because the ideology is rooted on the material basis and systems of production. We don't have it here. It's rentier, sharing of proceeds, which we are not even part of. We are not part of the production of productive process of the crude oil, which is the mainstay. So going forward, I want you to also reflect the other perspectives of the state. For instance, the political economics talks about a specific modality of power relations, especially in a society that has transcended the communal mode of production. We have a mode of production here. That's the key question. As long as we don't have it, then the issue of ideology will be a big problem. On the 1998-99 elite, what I want to refer to as elite consensus, the military bureaucratic class against the political class, the huge promotions you mentioned about, the retirements from massive retirements of senior military officers. And I don't think most of them are from the Air Force. It comes across. Many of them from the Army, those that have been exposed to political offices, those that have enjoyed political appointment outside the strict military formations. You have noted rightly that over time it's decreasing. A lot of them found their way into the National Assembly as a system of easing them out of power, not to create shocks in terms of what Dr. Okeke talked about, not having any base to support their stolen wealth. We are fine-tuning it now. Gradually, it is giving way, and less of them are finding their way into parliament. And the huge resources, like you noted in your the graph you used to illustrate, the huge defense allocations is a strategy to somehow keep them happy without thinking of venturing into the body politic of the nation. But trends are changing now as our democracies getting more enrooted. Probity, even within the military spending, is what we are beginning to see. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I have a rather esoteric question for you, and it's about the age of the elected officials that you mentioned. You said that they were getting older when the population was actually getting younger, but you didn't seem to link it to the breakdown of the elite consensus or the elite pact. And what I want to posit to you is a theory in that there were certain elements within the elite that were excluded from that elite pact in 1999. And they were excluded because a decade before that, they had been the front runners who had been banned from elections and had expended tremendous amounts of resources trying to get elected only for the elections to be annulled. And by 1999, their faith in the transition system had been eroded, and they put forward younger people to go in their place, thinking that the transition wasn't going to hold, or democracy wasn't going to last. And as soon as those people got to taste power, they wanted to stay in power, and therefore you had a conflict between the old and the new guard. And you can see that play out in PDP in 2015. If you look at the PDP chairman at the time, not Mwazu, but Lamanga Tuko, and those are the people who were behind him, they were from that 80s and early 90s that came forward to challenge the Amechis of this world, who now, and the Sarakis of this world, who now moved over from APC to PDP. So I think that might enrich the conversation a bit more than that's my thought.
Yeah, excellent.
Can I take those three questions? And the tougher your questions are, the smarter I get. So keep learning from each other. I like the preface to the question that Nigeria is not exceptional. The famous quote that you read in an editorial in Nigeria from Achebe about every other week, that the problem of Nigeria is a problem of leadership. A few pages later in the book, nobody ever quotes the part after that where he says, Nigeria is not exceptional. We are no different from many other people in any other part of the world. So, I like the premise that Nigeria is not exceptional. Taking that seriously, I think proportional representation has been on the table for a lot of countries. It was a recommendation of the Electoral Reform Commission here, I think in 2010, that should be explored as a serious option. One thing we know from comparative political institutions is that proportional representation is difficult to work with the presidential system. And so if you want PR, you have to throw out a presidency. And if you throw out a presidency, then you've got a parliamentary government. And if you've got a parliamentary government, you've got the First Republic. And how did that go? So, so that's one thing to think about PR. One thing which was a very big trend in the post-Soviet states was to do both, where half of the legislature is elected as PR, so that you can have small interests represented and so forth, and half of the legislature elected on geographical basis, like it is in Nigeria. And so, I think some of the research has said that that's worked out okay in some of those places, but I remain undecided about what to do with that. What I do know would happen is that if you have a PR system, you probably have a Biafra party. You might have a women's party, which could be kind of interesting, cool. Right? But you might also have a Shiite party. So now, picture these people coming together in the National Assembly and fighting over oil. Do you want that? Or do you want, that process to play out through some other political system where, you get the picture. Yeah. Secondly, do I have a Western view of the state? I don't know. I mean, you like your borders, right? I mean, you're working really hard to defend them right now, right? That's the state. All of the African countries got together in 1962 when they formed the African Union, and they said, we accept the colonial borders and just stay out of my borders. And that was a conscious decision. It's well documented. Was that a good thing to do? I don't know, but that's what we're stuck living with. One scholar who's really thought outside the box about that is Pierre Engelbert. He wrote a book where he ends the book by saying, what would happen if we throw out all the colonial borders from the Berlin Conference, and how might this make Africa better? Those are useful thought experiments. I think you're right, the process of nation building is sort of ongoing, especially in a multi-ethnic federation like Nigeria. In the Oxford handbook that I mentioned, Nonso Owikili has a chapter on state building in Nigeria, which is pretty interesting. You also mentioned ideology based on material conditions, and that's not true everywhere. The trend in most of the world, much of the developed world right now, is the emergence of post-material values. This is the research by Pippa Norris, Ronald Engelhardt, and others, and what they find is that once countries reach a certain level of development, people start to care about different issues. They start to care about the environment. They start to care about minority rights. They start to care about things that are actually not material. And, Nigeria has never had an industrial economy, but, there is a state which people are fighting for control over. So there's an internal dynamic which is ongoing that suggests that, the state exists and it's a reality. If it's a reality in people's imaginations, that's a question that I leave for you. On the comment that a lot of military found their way to the National Assembly, yes, that was my point, that's how the PDP helped coup-proof things after the transition, one of the many things that they did. The real question, though, is that the conditions for a successful transition, I think, are different from the conditions for successful democratic development. That is the national conversation that you are having right now. And so I am listening because this is a really interesting conversation. Lastly, what's the theory of demographic shift? What was the point of sort of showing the data and the representatives getting older and so forth? I think the point was that the party wasn't changing and the country was changing. And, you know, I think there are opportunities there for future research. And I think it's, you know, when you put these different trends together, it's sort of not coincidental that, you know, it's a very young country, one of the fastest population growth rates in the world, as you all know. But, you know, politicians were getting older and older. It was not because of incumbency. I mean, there was close to 100% turnover in the House of Representatives over those 5 elections. So, you know, young people wanted something different, and again, looking at the youngest age cohort, there are differences in their partisan preferences, at least in 2015. I don't know about now.
Let's take a few questions from the front. And
congratulate Carl for the book. In fact, when I looked at the cover of the book and I saw President Muhammadu Buhari, I was thinking it was a biography of Buhari or something. But what came into mind is, since 1999, I think there was nobody that has shaped the political landscape than Buhari himself, because he was a major candidate against the incumbent in 2003, in 2007, in 2011, in 2015, and now in 2019. And he ran on different political parties. So I want you to address the issue of individual personalities, not the political parties. Because from the look of things, what we have, and that is why the issue of ideology is not clear, because individuals cross-carpet from one party to another in the quest of power. Atiku was in APC, the majority of people around the president were in PDP. So I want you to speak to that, and so that overlap that happens, and I'm talking about the fact, political part. Actually, it was a PDP part. It was only PDP that had that arrangement, not other political parties. So it wasn't particularly representative of the national interest. So I just want to draw your attention to that. And finally, in determining issues that political parties are campaigning on, how do you do that? Because we have the party manifesto, we have the billboards, and most of these billboards actually were erected by party supporters who may not have connection whatsoever with the parties, and that was how APC ended up denying most of the promises they made in 2015. So even knowing what exactly the position of the candidates and the parties are is somehow a mystery when you talk about the Nigerian political landscape. In fact, politicians even disown some of the pronouncements that they have made. But thank you. I look forward to reading the book. My name is Aminu. I teach law at Faculty of Law based University.
There are massive promotion in the military. There are increases in budget, and therefore there is no coup. We don't seriously believe that. You know, I think that you need to tighten up that hypothesis, because if you were to take into consideration the Nigerian perception of the military, no matter the amount of budget increases or massive promotion, the military will not be welcome. That is one. Two, there is also the African Union perception, attitude towards military coup. That in fact dampened military expenditure. And then there's also the international community. They are also very averse to military coup. So I don't think that hypothesis, you need to tidy up that hypothesis very well. Coup proofing is, well, I find it odd. Anyway, you need to define very precisely what you mean by weaker states voted for some parties. Because we have 36 states in Nigeria, and so you've got to group them and then give us an indicator of what constitutes weaker states. And you need to tidy up those areas. Well, I'm going to read your book. I cannot criticize it because I've not read it. But I just find some of their processes very troubling. One of the points have been made by somebody about demography, changes in demography. What are you pointing at? Are you saying that Nigeria needs old people in the National Assembly, or we need a younger generation in the nation? So you didn't conclude there, but I wouldn't take you up since I've not read your book. But it's a good try, sir.
All right, I think we'll go in order. Does populism win? So populism wins right now. The tricky thing is that I think populism is not really sustainable. That's what we know from the waves of populism that pop up in periodic places around the world every now and then. Going back to Andrew Jackson in the United States, who's sort of considered the model of populism in the 1800s. What populism means is, technically, I think, is a leader who is able to circumvent the political institutions in order to appeal to the people directly and to claim to be their authentic voice. So, I think in 2015 there were elements of a populist platform, but the candidate absolutely went through the institutions to do that. Donald Trump did not effectively do that. I mean, he won the candidacy of the Republican Party despite every politically relevant party elite trying to help him, trying to prevent him from emerging as the winner. So that's what we mean by populism. And so, it's still an emerging area of research, and I think we're still learning when populism fades. So if you're already looking ahead to 2023, I might say, hold off, campaign on women. The second question about the personality of candidates. Campaign with women. The personality of candidates, that's a tough question. One of the things that I'm looking at right now in my research, not specific to Nigeria, is the psychology of celebrity worship and the role of celebrities in politics, just to see how that shapes voter perception differently from people who are technocratic and people who are sort of policy experts. Policy experts usually aren't the good winning candidates. Bill Clinton was maybe an exception in that regard, where he could appeal to people and connect with their emotions, and he also read the briefing book at night. Kind of miss a president like that. I didn't talk a lot about the manifestos in the book or in the talk. I did read the manifestos and refer to them a little bit in the chapter that explores this content analysis of the issues. That's because I was not testing to see if parties live up to their manifestos. And some of the recent Nigeria political science research in a book edited by Joseph Bashagba and others has one or two chapters on party manifestos and do they matter and this sort of thing. So I think it tells us more about Nigerian political parties by looking at what they actually talked about. And that's what I think we've got here. But if you want to study manifestos, that's fine. I mean, I think the absence of zoning in the APC manifesto, if that's still the case, is kind of interesting. The doubt about coup-proofing, I want to give a holistic story. I don't think you read any one of those examples I gave independently. And I think if you do, then you probably don't get a story of coup-proofing. What I think you need to read is a reluctance to prosecute or investigate corruption in 1998 and 1999, explicit guarantees to a number of bad guys in the Abacha junta, and I named them, who were not prosecuted. Indeed, some of them were promoted within the military to the outrage of the human rights communities such as the Civil Liberties Organization and the Constitutional Rights Project. So that's 2. 3, the military spending, that's the 3rd data point. And 4, military promotions, that's the 4th data point. 5, all these people coming into the PDP, and the PDP paving the way for the military to go into the private sector. That's 5 data points, plus interviews with former generals that I conducted, all telling me a similar story. It's just what you need to do, is, the nice thing about being in academia is that, again, you can sort of pull back from the Twitter feed and take some time to add some of these things together. And so I think that's a pretty good, pretty convincing case. And I think, just what that means is that Nigerians are still living with the transition, for better and for worse. And, you're in a process of renegotiation for what the new, understanding is. What do I mean by weaker states? I wasn't measuring the capacity of states. I was measuring I measure the financial well-being of states and the financial well-being of people as they describe their own conditions within those states. I do that through debt. I do that through internally generated revenue. I do that through literacy, if we take literacy as a proxy for development. And I do that through the variable level of disposable income aggregated up to the state level. So 4 different measures, all perform similarly, but the one that was most statistically significant across every test is debt. So weaker states, well, not weaker states, now I'm using your language, states that were financially less sound or more vulnerable or more inclined to So, did I miss anything, Patrick?
No, that's it.
That's it, okay. Should I go
I'm
sit
just
down again?
trying to see if we have 2 minutes to take one more question. Yeah,
about clarification.
Oh.
You said PDP campaigned on weddings and all that. You didn't quite get that. What did you mean?
Weddings and funerals.
Yeah, weddings and funerals.
So these are the issues that, the main issues that I coded using a content analysis software called NVivo. It took several months. It's based on 929 independent data points from 2,390 newspaper articles. And within the book, there are subcategories under each one of these. And I know that I appropriately placed those subcategories under the respective categories here because the NVivo software allows you to do a word map of frequency of where words actually fit together. So there's actually another visual showing you all of that. So let me try explaining for the 3rd time. If you weren't talking about one of these things, it was not coded in that 929 data points. If the PDP had been talking about one of these things, it would have been coded. So the interesting implication of that is that I think as a party you're better off talking about the issues. And that's all that meant. So we had to eliminate more articles where the PDP was talking about stuff because they weren't talking about the issues. If they had been talking about the issues, then they would have been included.
Excellent. So a comment from the lady, just to get some gender balance.
Thank you for your presentation, but 2 things come out. One, to what extent did you consider the factor of incumbency? Did it play for or against Jonathan at that time? 2, when you go back to your results, that sort of showed how the parties performed across the issues. Perhaps another interesting area of research to look at how positive the government in power is able to communicate some of the results of their policies and issues over and above the opposition that would definitely on the other side will see issues around it. Because we know that a lot of investment went into power, for instance, during the PDP time. How effective was their communication in terms of the politicking time to convince Nigerians that indeed this was what was about? And we see the same thing playing out even now with the APC. How effective have been able to communicate some of the results that speaks to the issues and therefore convince the electorate. And finally, a lot have been said about democratic stress, democratic learning, but I see it as the development or evolution in our political culture. Now, to what extent is this playing out in terms of the politicians or the power play in recognizing the fact that Nigeria's political culture is developing and evolving, and so we're living gradually we're living actually persons, and whatever you bring to the table, and we're moving to the era of ideas, ideologies, and the power of convincing the politic.
Thank you. And the very
My name is Kenneth.
Is that why?
I work with Nextier. So my question, maybe I missed it while I was walking around. I think if you're talking about Nigerian politics without mentioning issues like ethnicity, religion, it is not comprehensive. Because you cannot talk about issues, you cannot talk about economy to, let's say, somebody that did not complete secondary school. Because most of Nigerians, we have more illiterates than we do with literates. So you cannot talk about such issues like social issues, economy, insecurity. You might talk about insecurity or snatches of it, but you cannot talk about economy with an illiterate person. So what do you have to say about ethnicity and religion in politics? What role does it play?
thank you very much.
I'm starting to feel like I'm on a presidential campaign here. And the election just got extended a week, and I got to keep talking. And thanks again, Patrick, for organizing this, and I'm really happy to be involved with Nextier. Patrick and I just met very recently, and you've shown that you can really pull things together greatly, and you very clearly have, a very well-educated and very informed following, and so I feel better educated and better informed now. So thanks again for putting this together, and thanks for the staff for working on this so much. The first question was, would this hold at the state level, and would this hold for the National Assembly? I doubt it. I think the way I would explore that as a political scientist would be to look at electoral coattails first, to see and sort of the party strength within a state. There are some ways of doing that. So, for example, it could be the vote share of parties in a state, but it could also be sort of the number of elected representatives from party X and Y in a state, and so forth. But, I spent, as I said, I went to 10 different states for this research, and, it was clear from the party officials that I met with that they were talking to the national party, and the party was sort of telling them what to do, what issues to talk about, and that sort of thing. But I think the issues are really different at the local level. I was in Obio Akbor in Rivers State a couple of times in 2014, 2015, 2017. And, in Obio Akbor, they were not talking about, this stuff. They were talking about who's going to be the chairman of this local government area, and who's going to get the money, and this sort of thing. So, but I edited a book in 2015 with Joseph Ashagba and Edward McMahon on subnational politics in Africa, and there are 3 or 4 chapters in there by young Nigerian political scientists I'd like you to check out, because we were trying to think through these kinds of issues. What's happening in the state? Everybody goes to Abuja and writes a dissertation. What's happening in the states? One of the interesting findings that Yahya Baba in his chapter found in that book was that over the period of about 2 election cycles, there were precisely 0 women in the state assemblies in the Northwest. 0 in the state assemblies. So, lots of things to explore, and get out there and do that. Do some research on the National Assembly and how things are different at the state level. So I said in my preface that I wasn't going to talk much about ethnicity. So ethnicity isn't even in this regression table because it was not statistically significant. That's the House of Fulani variable, but it's also a really bad idea to test ethnicity at the state level in Nigeria, because there are so many ethnic groups within each state. Even if you're talking about a place in the southeast, it's not a good idea. That is why I had a whole separate chapter which looked explicitly at ethnicity using the survey data. The survey data, people are asked as one of their first demographic questions to self-identify. And in the survey of 4,000 Nigerians, there were 97 different ethnic groups that self-identified, which to me suggests that it's a very broad cross-section of people. And there's a paragraph in the book saying, here's the portion of people who are Hausa or Fulani, here's the portion who were Yoruba, here's the portion who Igbo. And then I cite the anthropological and ethnographic research saying these proportions are consistent with what we already know about these ethnic communities. What does that, this show? This shows that, yeah, ethnicity does still matter a lot. But the really scary thing was that religion mattered even more. And so you put that together with, a narrative about the PDP and some of the Christian associations in 2015, and this is something that I think we all really, Nigerians really need to think about, and may need to revisit the institutional structure for religious moderation or secularism, in political campaigns and so forth. That's what the Muslim variable in that second row indicates, is that it is, the religious identification of a voter was even more statistically significant than the ethnic identification of a voter in predicting who he or she will vote for in 2015. So I said I would begin with some good news and end with some possibly bad news, and so there's your not so good news, I guess. So the book is Contemporary Nigerian Politics. You can buy it on Google Books electronically right now. It came out in paperback in the United Kingdom a couple of weeks ago, and Patrick has very kindly ordered a batch. I hope you'll come back in a couple of days when they arrive from Cambridge and you're able to purchase them. And really, really very grateful for this conversation and for your stimulating questions that keep me accountable.
Thank you very much, Professor LeVan, and thank you for making time to join us for this conversation. We try to hold these conversations because we think they're important, especially as we're in Abuja, where we hope that evidence will inform policy. We intend to have the next development discourse event here on Friday, March 15th. It just works out to be a Friday. I mean, I don't like Mondays or Fridays, but it's going to be with Professor Peter Lewis, new book, Theaters of War, Collective Violence in Nigeria, and it's going to be hosted on the platform of Nextier SPD. And on that note, thank you very much for coming, and please hang around. I'm not sure if we still have drinks downstairs. I hope we do, but let's network and get to know each other. Thank you very much.